Well, I have a lengthy introduction for Alexandra Kleeman here. And I just, before we get started, want to welcome you all again. Thank you for joining us virtually. I know we all have some level of Zoom exhaustion, and at the same time, it's just, terrific to be able to gather like this across spaces and times and geographies, and to be able to host Alexandra Kleeman, who's such a remarkable thinker and writer, and just a beautiful creator of sentences. And it's truly an honor to have you with us. And I'm really excited to be introducing you this evening. So I'll be reading from my computer, so sorry if I'm looking away, but like I said, it's truly a pleasure to be introducing Alexandra Kleeman this evening. Throughout the pandemic, Alex and I have met several times via Zoom, interviewing one another for various things. We've inhabited each other's work without ever meeting face-to-face in the three-dimensional world, though that's going to change next week. Our relationship is framed by distance and screens, a condition I began to think about more seriously as I was reading her latest book. In her virtuosic second novel, Something New Under the Sun, Kleeman examines the seductive power of various social structures and forms of media that reinforce and even exploit the natural distances that exist between people. In doing so, she exposes the risks of late capitalism's hollow and dangerously rational logic, which is capable of persuading humans to turn themselves into products. The characters that animate her novel are changed by her language into rather inanimate things. Thus, Kleeman unveils the sadistic appetite for domination that propels capitalism's most distorted and distorting cravings. In Something New Under the Sun, a different kind of food chain emerges, an artificial kind, one that seems to exist apart from the natural food chain we've always known. Cassidy Carter, a young Hollywood star, is consumed voraciously by her fans. She in turn consumes them. She lives off their psychic energy, their attention. She does so with the awareness and control of a puppeteer. This cycle of consumption, executed in an uneven field where multiple asymmetries of power intersect, requires Cassidy to maintain an attitude of shallowness and apathy, of detachment even from herself. She's engulfed in an industry that turns her into a product for its own profit, and that brings in other humans to feed her, to bolster her sense of her own position in this deliberately constructed system. Enter Patrick, a writer whose novel is being turned into a film, and whose wife and daughter have left their home to go on a morning retreat at a camp called Earthrich, where each day they sit cross-legged in a circle with other mourners and listen to a morning report on the incremental destruction of the environment, and who feel the weight of Patrick's scrutiny, his insistence that they just get on with things from afar. To say that the film adaptation of his novel is adjacent to the plot of his book would be an understatement. There's hardly any part of the film script that mirrors his book, a novel about a reckoning with his own family that gets abandoned in the translation from text to screen. Meanwhile, greedy fires roar across California, consuming the forests, sending the horses to a narrow strip of shore where they are stuck without drinking water. Coyotes scream out like hurt children, and water has been replaced with the artificial drink water that people are increasingly dependent on, addicted to. Never mind that their language begins to break down, that their minds incrementally descend into the confused remoteness of dementia. Take this paragraph about 2/3 of the way through the novel. An observer would see intelligence in the way the fire crawls, seeking new substance to consume, the way it moves in small, tidy increments and sudden leaps, the way it seems to head for the homes, for the cars, for the firefighters standing watch with masks on to filter their air. At the highway's periphery, a helicopter passes overhead, dropping a sheet of water on a child-height fence of fire. So even the fire is has this kind of capitalistic drive to it. Something New Under the Sun is a cross-genre apocalyptic novel. It is cerebral, conceptual, folkloric, and noir, an impossible film script. It is a story within a story that is a commentary about narrative itself. Above all, it's a novel that investigates the very concept of representation and the dangers of privileging the image over the person and product over process. Alexandra Kleeman is the author of Intimations, a short story collection, and the novel You Too Can Have a Body Like Mine, which is just brilliant, and was awarded the 2016 Bard Fiction Prize and was a New York Times Editor's Choice. In 2020, she was awarded the Rome Prize and the Berlin Prize. Her fiction has been published in the New Yorker, the Paris Review, Zoetrope, Conjunctions, Guernica, and other writing has appeared in Harper's, the New York Times Magazine, Vogue, Tin House, and Plus One, and The Guardian. Her work has received fellowships and support from Breadloaf, Gerasi, the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts, and the Headlands Center for the Arts, and she's an assistant professor at the New School. We're very lucky to be in her company tonight, so please join me in welcoming Alexandra Kleeman to our virtual stage.
Thank you so much for having me. I recently drove back to New York from the West Coast, going through, several states worth of wildfire smoke, followed by a brief lull where I passed through South Bend and thought about all of you who I would be meeting virtually. And then back to the flooded East Coast where we got promptly stuck in New Jersey. So it's been a long trip to get here and to be able to look at your faces in person, making you much closer in some ways than when I sort of passed through your town late at night and thought about how close Notre Dame was and also how far. Time and space seem different now, right? They seem collapsible, expandable, and elastic in a new way. I'm just going to read from the beginning of this book because it's a section that needs no introduction and no background information. And I understand many of you have read it before, and this may be a part that, for me, because I read the beginnings of manuscript over and over and over again. Every revision process starts from the beginning and often peters out before I get to the middle. I know these words like I know the back of my hand, or more so. All right. On the palm-sized screen, it looks curiously real, like something he's already seen. She slouches in the drugstore aisle, clawing the skin on the back of her hands, sunglasses black and gleaming in the halogen daylight. This is the girl, a bored blonde, her head at once too big and too little for her whittled-down frame. Smaller than life, shorter than expected, not as pretty. Torso adrift within a pair of creased track shorts and an oversized black sweatshirt with Gucci spelled out on front in serifed white letters. The footage has a handheld wobble. From time to time, it sinks behind a shelf and you can hear the sound of close breath, the body of the camera holder hovering out of view. She keeps taking a box off the shelf, putting it back, picking it up again. Against a background of sanitary napkins, pregnancy tests, and adult diapers, she looks aimless, misplaced, like a child rehearsing an adult gesture. Patrick Hanlon shields his eyes from the California sun and squints down at the miniature face on screen, shrunken behind oversized lenses. He can't help but feel disrespected, seated off to the side of these production kids half his age but wearing better clothes. Slim-limbed youths who picked him up at the airport and then detoured, without asking, to this noisy poolside bar nestled in the crotch of an overpriced hipster hotel. The potted palms by the bar all have smiles painted on their trunks and sultry cartoonified eyes made to be photographed and uploaded to the feed. At check-in, bowls of red rubber condoms sit gratis, waiting to be snatched up by smooth-armed men and women, delighted at the novelty of a cock that resembles a balloon animal. Now he's jet-lagged and dehydrated, headachy from drinking a jumbo gin and tonic in the glaring bright, mouth dry and tasting of stale wool as he leans over to watch their video clips on his scuffed-up smartphone. Plastic glasses litter the tabletop, as the kids slurp from twin Bloody Marys as tall as a toy poodle. What is this? Patrick asks, as the girl in the video fingers the sealed opening of the little box. What am I seeing? You have to start from the beginning to get the full effect, says one of the kids encouragingly. He's wearing a short-sleeved button-up patterned with small embroidered horseshoes. Like a horror movie, adds the pale, smooth-faced one holding the phone. His arm drifts toward and away from Patrick randomly, making it difficult to follow the tiny happenings on the tiny screen. You need those shots of the suburbs and hedges and mailboxes to prep for the massacre that comes later. When the violence is unleashed, the viewer can't comfort themselves by thinking it's a neighborhood fundamentally different from their own. They've already swallowed the pill. Like at the beginning of Scream, where she's making popcorn on the stovetop, says the one in the horseshoe shirt. Yeah, or in Triumph of the Undead Dead, where they're in a used car lot arguing over the price of the station wagon right before they get devoured, says the arm. Devoured? Patrick has no idea what he's supposed to be looking for. The girl on screen is famous, he knows, but he can't imagine why. She has long yellow hair and an overstuffed pout. She could be any teenager at the mall, an expensive mall, riding the escalator up and down in the afternoon stupor, clutching outsized shopping bags in both hands that swing slowly in the breeze. In the small and possibly clear picture, her mouth is set in a stiff line, but somehow he senses that she could burst into tears at any moment. She reminds him of his daughter, or is it a combination of his daughter and wife? On the screen in his mind, he sees their delicate mouths projected side by side, familiar lips that he's wiped with a towel, precisely etched and painfully exact. Back on the East Coast, 3 hours ahead, they must be setting the table for dinner, portioning out scoopfuls of pasta and salad, his 9-year-old daughter frowning in concentration as she folds flimsy paper napkins in half. Lately, whenever he tries to picture their faces, whether smiling or unsmiling, the image won't hold. Involuntarily, he always sees the smooth lines tremble and collapse into twists of emotion, the unbeautiful shapes of someone about to cry. Skip ahead, says Horseshoe Shirt to the other. We're losing him. But think about how much of the story we'll lose, the arm argues, if we rush it. The ambient time, boredom, irritation, atmosphere, the texture, the suspense. A long stasis that, like winter blossoming into spring, reveals surprises within. What this sort of footage lacks in plot structure, it gains back in the quiet sorcery of something happening out of nothing, monotony upended by the eruption of something new. The cinephile in me can't abide. So true, but avoiding loss is impossible in a world that struggles to conjure even the basic sense of presence. Capture itself is a form of loss. All a matter of PPI, Horseshoe replies, and they nod at each other solemnly. The video is dragged ahead an inch or so. On screen, the girl looks furtively toward the checkout counter, then back down. Silently, she slides a finger under the flap, splits open the little box, wriggles her hand into the aperture in the cardstock. She's peering inside now as she pushes the contents around with the tip of a slender manicured finger. Now the shot is tightening, honing in on the box, which seems to be full of tampons. The girl deftly slides 3 of them out and pockets them without looking, staring straight out in front of her like she's searching for someone on the other side of the room. She's stealing tampons? Patrick asks. Shh, say the kids. The camera lurches into motion as the cameraman steps out from behind the shelves and speaks. Hey, Cassie, what you doing? You gonna take those without paying? His voice is cheerily unfriendly. Smile into the camera. Come on, baby. Cassidy looks up, her face soft and innocent and surprised for a moment, the mouth slightly parted and revealing the tips of 2 adorably large front teeth. Then the features rearrange. What the fuck, growls Cassidy, her grip tightening. You guys stake out the maxi pad aisle now? Do you want to hide in my shower and watch me put it in? The cameraman giggles humorlessly. Come on, Cassidy, says his voice behind the lens. I don't think your fans would appreciate that kind of language. Give us a Cassie Keen kid detective salute. Can you do that? the one from the TV show. Cassie lets out a weird, strangled sound. She hurls what's in her hand right at the lens, and a mess of brightly colored cylinders bursts once, like big, clumsy confetti, as the camera whirls down and back up again, seeking her face. What it finds looks ferocious. "Press delete, cunt," Cassie says, her hand reaching, "or I'm appropriating that fucking phone." So this is all being shot on a camera phone, Patrick thinks, scratching the side of his neck. Incredible resolution. Phones, he thinks, are the one thing in the world that seem always to be getting better. Now that the two of them are in motion, the incredible resolution seems less equipped to handle all the activity. She's coming toward him with her hands out, claw-like, grabbing things off the shelves and hurling them hard at the arms or upper body of the man holding the phone, causing the picture to tremble. He tries to keep up the nonchalant chatter, but it's clear from the lengthening pauses that he's in some degree of pain. He's running into the shelves, knocking down prim rows of packaged cookies and crackers that fall to the floor with whispery thuds. At the same time, Cassie Carter has driven him toward the exitless back of the store, into the aisle with the household cleaners, and is battering him with a value-sized jug of hypoallergenic laundry detergent. She grips with both hands and swings it like a sledgehammer. A little bracelet on her wrist glitters in the light. She's telling him to give her the phone, but she's saying other things too. Fuck the menstruation industrial complex for making her buy a pack of 24 when all she needs is 1 or 2 to get to the end of her cycle. Fuck America for being a nation-sized landfill run by Lexus rednecks who'll never in their lives be able to comprehend the actual spiritual profundity of 5 moons of Triton. Fuck all her fans for buying the magazines with the stolen photos of one of her old Brazilian wax sessions. Her fans are creepy goblins and would chop her into little bits and eat the pieces raw if they could. And they would take a billion photos of it and probably tag her in every single one. By now, the phone is on the floor, camera pointed up at Cassidy, who looms over it with a dark expression, her legs long and bronzed and extending impossibly up toward the sky. As she unscrews the lid to the detergent and upends it all over the cameraman's occluded body, Patrick can't help but think that female anger has an outlandish quality to it. In a face rigorously conditioned to be beautiful, ugly feelings come as a violation of basic principles, like the monstrously large species of coconut-eating rat he had read about on the internet, discovered on a tropical island when it fell from a tree onto a passing scientist. While she was clubbing the head and back of the cameraman, the lower half of Cassie's face had been screwed into a position of uncontrolled fury, the lower lip knotted and drawn down to expose smooth, square teeth. At the same time, the upper half of her face, enveloped by sunglasses, seemed perfectly placid. From the nose up, there was a sort of fragile glamour that you could have fallen in love with on the spot. And it was a truly fantastic nose, elegant but wholesome, lightly freckled, the tawdry bridge sleeking down to a delicate chiseled tip. It was the sort of nose that reminded you at first of other noses you had loved in days gone by, but then began by degrees to eclipse those other noses until all you could remember was this new nose, perfect and organic and whole. If he was honest about it, Patrick had always sensed a disjunction with girlfriends and mothers and even his own 9-year-old daughter, between the anger they professed to feel and the spectacular utility of that anger to startle and confuse. He had the eerie feeling when watching an angry woman that he himself was being watched from someplace deep inside her. Now, as he watches Cassidy shrug off the grasp of the drugstore employees who banded together to try to restrain her, he wonders if there's a tiny, childlike version of this woman pointing and laughing within the calm center of her rage. Suddenly, Cassidy grins. With one smooth movement, she reaches down into her track shorts, pulls out the spent tampon, and slings it at the cameraman's prone body. "Namaste," she shouts as she is led away. "And that," says the arm, pausing the clip, "is Cassie Carter. I can't believe you didn't know who she was. It's as if we found you on a Micronesian island and we're teaching you, like, what a flashlight is." "She's that famous?" Patrick asks, tilting the last drops of water from his drinking glass onto his sweaty neck. More. She was a Happy Meal toy. I had 2 when I was growing up. I used to make them karate fight each other. Horseshoe makes rigid motions with his hands. Okay, she's famous, but she's clearly crazy, says Patrick. I just don't think any serious film uses an actress who's assaulted someone in public, on video, over feminine hygiene. How could you guarantee that she'd behave herself? It's too risky. Crazy is bankable, says the arm, swiveling in his seat until he makes contact with their waitress. He lifts the empty water bottle and points to it with a hand shaped like a gun, then holds up 3 fingers. The waitress nods, gives a thumbs up, and rolls her eyes. So's free PR, like that video you just watched. So's the #1 nose in America and the former face of Bellinex. Bellinex, says Patrick. That acne cream that caused seizures. We made a lot of money, though, Horseshoe says. Patrick stares down at the paused image. The girl is frozen, sandwiched between 2 drugstore employees in red vests who hold her by the elbows. She's looking back toward the camera with a gigantic, diamond-hard smile. With her right hand, she gives a cheery 2-fingered salute, like a Girl Scout, but cuter. I hear you. I see your point. But I'm going to have to veto her, Patrick says with finality. He leans back in his seat and swigs from his glass to punctuate. Braided strands of plastic in the seat back squeal as he adjusts his mask. There's an uncomfortable silence. When the arm speaks, he sounds a couple years older and somberer. Yeah, well, with my regrets, he says, you aren't actually attached to this film with any veto power per se. I hope you had a chance to look over your contract and the duties and responsibilities outlined, therein. Patrick's head begins to ache a little. He squeezes his eyes open and shut. Even when his eyes are closed, the light seems to find its way in, soaking the eyelid and turning his visual field a fleshy red. There's a knotty feeling in his throat as he weighs the possibility of getting his phone out and looking up his contract right now, right in front of their bright, inquisitive twerp eyes. He looks out at the dull turquoise pool, fully engulfed by the looming shadow of the hotel above. Neon green pool floats shaped like hearts rotate aimlessly in the blue. The arm explains patiently. Your contract stipulates that in exchange for the rights to your novel Elsinore Lane, the access to which is bestowed gratis, you will receive 1 paid production assistant position, budget contingent, which you may bestow at your discretion upon the individual of your choice, including yourself, if you are your own choice. Horseshoe shirt pats Patrick on the back a few times. You're one of us, man, he says in a friendly way. The arm gives him a tight smile. Don't you? He says, lifting his hands up in mock surrender. Messenger. The waitress comes up with a tray carrying 3 bottles of water, each one molded into a faceted shape resembling a diamond, indicating its premium quality. California sunlight shimmies through the hard plastic, pale and golden at the same time, casting a pattern of dancing light on the bistro tabletop, like the bright model at the bottom of a swimming pool. She places the bottles on the surface in front of them. Slowly, one by one, she opens each bottle and sets the caps together on the far end of the table. She picks up the bottle in front of Patrick and pours it into his drinking glass. She does the same with the other 2 bottles and glasses. The water tumbles in, cold and transparent and odorless. She looks at the 3 of them sitting in silence and walks away toward another table. Thanks.
Thank you for that wonderful reading, Alex. Yeah, it's a great introduction to kind of the larger themes and just atmosphere of the novel. And one of the things that I really admired about the book was your descriptions of landscape and this feeling that even though the fire is roaring, like I kind of always felt like I was at the bottom of a swimming pool where there was no water, but the light is refracting. And just the incredible descriptions of animals and nature and food. It's just such a richly inhabited space. And I think that, it just kind of, the descriptions really struck me, and it just sings off the page. And we talked a lot about the landscape of it as well in class. So we have Q&A now. I don't know if anyone has already put any questions in the chat, but we can also use the little hand thing. There we go. I already saw one. Austin, go for it.
Thank you. Oh, did I freeze? Okay, there I am.
You're good.
Thank you so much for this reading. And we read your book in our class, and it was a real pleasure to talk about. And thanks again for coming.
So honored. Thank you. Thank you all for reading it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for writing it. One thing we talked about in class that we were really interested in was there's this kind of beautiful tragedy in the novel where so many of your characters are so sort of blindsided and self-involved and almost kind of narcissistic. And then there's this moment where everyone is kind of maybe realizing some things about themselves, but it's already too late. And there's a real sense of kind of belatedness, I think, by the end of the book. And we were sort of thinking of places where, we saw this potential for community kind of cracking through this sort of maybe bleaker world that you created. Some things we talked about were kind of Nora and her, fantasizing about banding up with the other kids, and maybe even though they're arguing against each other, the form posters are sort of creating a body of knowledge together in this sort of weirdly aggressive yet ultimately communal way. And I was just wondering if that was something you were thinking about in the book. And I don't know, because I feel on a surface read, it's presents this bleakness, but I think maybe investigating some of the cracks, there's this sort of kind of beauty and tragedy and how some of your characters are relating to each other.
Yeah, thank you so much for that read. And I think that, if any of you here in this Zoom are writing a novel, there's a particular kind of sadness that goes along with the freedom of writing a novel, because suddenly, unlike in a shorter story form, you have the ability to sprawl and the ability to loop things into your world, to include them when they don't feel 100% necessary. I feel that's one of the permissions that the novel explicitly gives itself, that short stories take, that have to justify sometimes in a more intensive way. So suddenly when writing a novel, you feel like you have this expanded field, but at the same time, that expanded field, even if it holds up a mirror to reality, is never the same thing as reality. And that's something that I've always felt frustrated by, that there are things outside of even a scope that I set myself and make as wide as I want to make, that cannot be brought inside the picture, or can, but are still at the expense of something else. So one of the ways I could resign myself to writing, in my mind, this is when I try to write a novel of individuals, who are discrete and who have their own goals, and also have this sort of particular sadness that's associated with being an individual with your own narcissistic goals, a frame of mind that I think this late capitalist world often wants to put us in, because to fundamentally think and invest in, say, one's own career or one's advancement along this narrow path is to narrow your world in some sort of strategic way that might help you advance, right? But it was important to me to leave some holes there. For me, the sort of thinking and teaching that Nora is doing in her own world with her peers at this place, Earthbridge, we know that it's in contrast to what the adults are doing. We know that sometimes it's explicitly in a form of critique to the kind of escapism and maybe more realistic, but still self-indulgent nature of taking yourself away to a semi-utopian commune. We know that they're doing that work, but we can't see it. And that, to me, because it's given a place but not given space almost protects it for me, because it is no longer sort of contained and shoehorned into the novel form and into what I make available for it. It's something that I hope that people wonder about and try to complete on their own. Like, what is the solution that is better than Earthbridge? What is the more realistic, more engaged way to be in this world? And what is the model of sort of recognizing climate catastrophe or ecological catastrophe that doesn't involve a sort of retreat? So I think like one thing I go back to a lot is that in my first novel, there were a lot of human bodies. Again, there's human bodies in every novel, I suppose. But those bodies were leaky. The fear was contamination. The fear was mixing your own essence with some other essence and thereby changing your essence or making yourself indistinguishable. And the sadness in this book for me comes in a lot of ways from the fact that bodies are so discrete and dry and unerotic. Like, I think the moment I gave myself for, like, what stands in for sex in this book is Patrick rolling over on his hotel bed and kissing his own dry arm and imagining it was someone else doing it. I think that it's a sort of opposite construction of the human body than the one I used before. And I hope even as it arouses all of the sort of lonesome, bleak feelings of being an individual, I hope it creates a hunger also for the other thing that is messier.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. And Nora is such an interesting character in the way that she sort of withholds language even from her mom about her visions, right? Like, she's very, very protected in the novel. Naeem, I see your hand up, and then Lance.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much for your reading. So you've kind of been talking about this already, but I was really struck by kind of the tension between the communal elements of the novel and the intense, independence of the human characters. And the third person omniscient voice kind of dips into all these different points of view, both of humans, but also of animals and the landscape, elements of the landscape. And then there's the human characters who are so distanced from each other and how they, perceive the world. And that tension was really interesting to me. And you recently gave an interview in the Thresholds podcast where you mentioned that part of your research for this novel was reading folklore from the Chumash people who lived in the area that we now call LA. And I wanted to ask you kind of how the folklore and how reading this folklore influenced your process in writing the novel, especially in relation to kind of that tension between the communal and the independent.
I think for me, a lot of research involves reading about things that I don't know how to build into the world precisely, but that show me where the limit of my world is. One thing that I was thinking about a lot in writing this book is the fact that the story unfolds in a landscape that has a long, deep history and also is home to indigenous culture that encompasses something like 150,000 people living in the same area, a very large and vibrant community, which exists outside of the bounds of what we think of as present day Hollywood industry, filmmaking, and things. And I narrowed my focus in this book, I think, in a way that feels overly constrictive to me sometimes, but is related also, I think, to this sort of character-anchored, individual-anchored mode of storytelling that I want to do a take on. And the moment where I try to expand that view was mostly in the last chapter, where I feel like we find our connection to Patrick severed suddenly by his sort of exit from this plane of existence. And then we're free to begin taking samples from an expanded timeline where we go back to far prehistory, Ediacaran period. And this is something I mourn, but in my last draft of this, I paired two sort of mirroring hunting scenes with one another. So on the one hand, that the Chumash often used to do a sort of fire-based hunting method where they would set fire to an area and it would cause, herd animals, deer, to congregate where they could then sort of be picked off. And it's a long tradition. It involves fire in this uniquely productive way that the peoples of that area used to tend the land and cultivate it, harvest from it, and maintain it in this healthy condition. And then it's followed by this similar sort of like ring-based hunting thing that I got from an account of like settlers in California, where they used to gather the whole town, surround an area, and start closing in on it step by step to drive all of the rodents toward the middle, at which point they would just be, bludgeoned. And there was this formal similarity between that really interested me. And after sort of a long conversation with my editor, I took out the previous one because in a thing that was supposed to give this impression of like briefly touching down on Earth at these disparate points, her argument was that to hit the same sort of note or pattern or image twice was too much. And I still struggle with it because I think there's such a contrast in the way that these two images operate and what they sort of mean in the context of the whole ecology of the place. But I also didn't want people to read it as an argument that like these two human behaviors are analogous and can be directly compared and are part of the same sort of trend moving toward there. So, I think that I struggled sometimes with to what extent my narrator could travel backwards and forwards in time in terms of its omniscience, and I stuck to moving around within space. But I think that there's another book there another impulse that will be displaced into the next work that I want to free myself up in those directions. Like, I don't know, sometimes during the process of writing a book, you experience this melancholy for the choices not taken for the other books that this book could have been. And that's one that I feel.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alex. Lance?
Yeah, thanks for that is a particular kind of sadness. I also was feeling a tension while reading that I was hoping you could comment on. It seems to me that these characters in this novel are really struggling to make any sort of meaningful connection between themselves. Yet the connection that you create between the readers and the characters' experience is so visceral. They get parched and we experience that thirst. They are disoriented and we sort of lose ourselves as well. And I understand that you also studied cognitive science, and I was wondering how those studies influence the tension between distance and embodiment in this novel and how it affects your writing practice more broadly as well.
That's a great question. I think that one of the things that drove me into writing fiction was the ability to inhabit a virtual body for longer periods of time and to channel more information through it and to feel like I was really engaged in creating sort of reality simulating experiences, a lot of which came through the body. When I worked in cognitive science, my focus was on embodied cognition and on the ways in which the motor system and the linguistic system interface, which, this doesn't seem like a counterintuitive idea to people who are readers, I think, but in the cog sci sort of scientific community, it was a counterintuitive idea that any piece of information you perceived with your brain drew at all from motor knowledge, bodily, spatial, or sensory representations. Like there's an idea, because the field sort of came out of a combination of psychology and computer science, that the mind is obviously like a computer, and anything we find about it that's not computer-like is a problem that needs to be worked out and systematized in some way. So I'm really fascinated by the way in which descriptions call on past experience, descriptions call on the body to mobilize its own knowledge of that sort of world, or what it's like to interact with that tool, or what it's like to hear the sound of a rustling, for example. It's not simply a dictionary definition, but it's something that we sort of leap into action with our whole body at some level. And in that way, I feel that I wanted to use characters in this book as sort of touch points into the most visceral and uncomfortable sort of aspects of something like a water shortage or a water inadequacy or a different type of water. Because if, if representations of language drive feelings in our body and drive a sort of bodily recreation and representation of them, then we can also use these language representations to create a feeling in the body that we've never truly experienced, to make real and concrete a threat that we can only sort of speculate on or imagine in think pieces and news articles could someday be something that we encounter. I'm wondering, along this book, about the distance between a real felt bodily threat and the sorts of physiological reactions that are evoked, and the threats that we conceptually understand are threats, the information we recognize as relevant to our own survival, but that don't or can't evoke the same immediacy of response. I don't know if what we need to respond to these larger sort of collective threats is a felt sense of their seriousness, or is an understanding that they'll never register in the same way that like a bear chasing after you in a picnic ground would, but they still require some sort of decisive sort of action. And in my personal case, I would think it's interpersonal action, it's collective action, and it's a sort of response that I think you often wish the characters would create among themselves, but that they continually fail to do. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That was great.
These are great questions and just such fantastic answers, Alex. Armand?
Yeah, hi. Firstly, I just wanted to reiterate how rich and complex and layered your novel is, at a plot level, at a prose level, at a philosophical level. You mix and play with genres, themes, and even aesthetics to a certain extent. And it's just so formally exciting and challenging to unpack. I feel as though you have a very flexible and generous definition of what a novel can be. So I was wondering, how do you as a writer, you've sort of answered this, but I was wondering if you could go deeper, start to think about what deserves to be included in a novel as ambitious as this one, what deserves a voice, what deserves to be so critically investigated, knowing that you probably have to sacrifice a lot of things that you probably want to talk about, but it doesn't fit within the realm of the novel.
Yeah. That's such a good question. I feel like there's still room to write encyclopedic novels, but the idea of representing everything also feels like a very constrained, like a process that will result in representation of the world that is obviously shaped like your own mind. So for me in writing this book, I wanted to define an inner bound, like the primary side of the book that I would allow to be punctured by things that seem outside, or by storylines unfolding in the absence or off to the side of main characters that seem important, contain like vital survival information, contain pieces of the water storyline that's developing about toxicity and accumulation and the relationship to the sort of public health crisis that is ROAD, random onset dementia. And sometimes show that they're there, but also not stretch the tether of the camera so much that I can depart from there. It's a particular feeling, I think, that I have in this time, that my ability to sort of feel in concert with the world and to comprehend sort of what's unfolding in this moment is constrained by my own individuality, by my perspective, by my inability to sort of turn information into experience, if that makes sense. So one of the difficulties for me, for example, is how was I going to represent the part of LA that I lived in, which is a very, very peripheral to the LA that most people I know experience, go back to, eat in, play in, or socialize in. I lived in the San Gabriel Valley, which is sometimes about an hour from downtown LA, sometimes a bit more depending on traffic. And it's where my family lives. It's where, I spend a good chunk of the time when I go back to visit, but it's not depicted in films or TV depicting LA. It's not in guidebooks. It's not on Instagram as far as my feed shows. And yet that's where I am sort of anchored in my personal experience. So if I'm writing about a place and I'm not drawing as much on the visceral things I experience, the places that I would go for walks and the things I remember from being a child, then what do I do with that place? And I thought, like, I'm going to treat it from the perspective of Cassidy and Patrick in this industry, like not a flyover state, a drive-through region. It's a place that people pass through on the highway as they're going off maybe to Joshua Tree, or as they're going off to Palm Springs. And so if you trace the highways that the books follow, you can see things off to the side that are the rooftops of places that I've walked around in, places that I've considered my home. And yet they don't become foreground for the book. And I think that this many different elements in this book are sort of links that are never clicked, abbreviated places, descriptions that summarize like an area that I know well or have a particular memory associated with. And that's how I exist in it. But I don't actually feel like I don't feel like I as a person am there in every part of it. Like, I think of it as a bubble novel. So thinking about, a sort of intensive industry that is isolated from a lot of the city that surrounds it in an environment that feels full and even packed to itself, but that for those reasons misses a lot of what is relevant to the story too. So some things that I did elect to put in there and that seemed disruptive are things that my editor argued with me about a lot again, like, people are very divided on the quail scene, where in the middle of eating a quail, we suddenly learn about the life cycle of the Japanese quail and how it's a popular laboratory animal. And I feel like anything in this book or in the world can be pushed on in that way and shown, a tunnel of information that goes much deeper than these sorts of encyclopedic accounts and these sorts of life cycle information, gestation and life habits. There's like the life of this particular animal sort of still waiting to be scratched below that account of the life, and I think that I read, for example, while I was writing this, a lot of Augustin Fernandez Malo, his Nasilla trilogy, which has something of the feel of an encyclopedic novel because it goes so intricately into bodies of information that feel ancillary, but it is all ancillary. It's just this network of intricate information that is not complete, but somehow feels so broad and distributed that it's a map of everything else, in the same way that highways cover the land and map it in some way without actually being the land or matching it or representing every part of it. It's a spread of information. So, I think that when you're looking to gesture toward the outside of your narrative and toward what cannot be included within it, or to what you're deliberately pushing to the outside, it feels like what you want to do is to make the reader aware of these sites that exist and have a reality to them and a presence, but that are not visited. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, we're right up against time, and I actually, that quail scene is one of my favorite scenes, like the way that she bites into it and then the bone snaps in two, and it comes really early. I think it's like page 40, and there was something about that gesture and the description of the bone snapping that, I don't know, it just really registered with me, and I kept going back to it and thinking about all of these ways in which there's contact between people but no communication, or there's communication but no physical contact, like the phones, it's just that something is really truly broken in the novel, and we as readers get to be suspended in that gap, right, and to feel that grief, and it accumulates over the course of the novel, and it really, I think by the end of it, we're kind of in a kind of morning lecture, right, sitting cross-legged, grieving for all of the ways that the communication is incomplete, between humans, but also between worlds, media, digital surfaces, animals, and you know, the ways that we're being kind of sprawled farther and farther apart. So thank you so much, Alex. It was really a pleasure to host you and to hear you talk about the book and to be reading it together. Yeah, it was such intensity. Thank you for all your questions, and to the audience for being here.
Thanks so much. If anyone has any other questions, or if you're curious in more depth, I always invite you to email me, alexandra.kleeman@gmail.com, and I would love to share some more of the research that went into the book, whether or not it found a voice in there, if that makes sense.
I would love to hear more about the research. Thank you, Alex. Have a great day, everybody. Big round of applause.
Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, thanks for being with us. Take good care, Alex. Bye-bye. Bye, everyone.